Well, good afternoon, and thank you for being here today for this installment in our speaker series at the Center of Politics and Governance here at the University of Texas. I'm Ryan Streeter. I'm the director of the center, and I'm pleased today to be able to welcome Will Howell from the University of Chicago here to talk about his new book. Dr. Howell is the Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics at the University of Chicago, and his book, Relic, published by Basic Books, just came out last week, reviewed in the Wall Street Journal just this morning, so if you haven't seen that, check it out. And the title is Relic, How Our Constitution Undermines Effective Government and Why We Need a More Powerful Presidency. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our guest, Dr. Will Howell from the University of Chicago.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks. Thank you, Ryan. Thanks for coming out. So I think what I'm going to do is give you a sketch of the book, lay out what the argument is, what some of the evidence is. I think Ryan and I are then going to have a little chat about it, and then we're going to open it up. This, in many ways, I found it's an interesting conversation starter. It's a change for me a bit, because most of my scholarship has been positive in nature, that is, trying to explain how politics is. And my co-author, Terry Moe, and I, we've written a fair bit on American political institutions, separation of powers issues, and we've focused on the presidency. But it's all been about trying to discern the conditions under which certain kinds of people can get stuff done. And how can presidents affect meaningful policy change? And whose interests are represented in the process. But again, it's been sort of positive in nature, and this is a shift towards a set of normative considerations. That is, it's a shift from what is to what ought to be. And so while the argument is deeply rooted in some empirical observations and some theoretical claims about American political institutions, it is an argument. And it's an argument that we felt compelled to make in this era of deep political dysfunction. The dysfunction's all around. This is not news to anybody in the room. It's all around. It takes lots of different forms. It expresses itself in gridlock. It expresses itself in laws that outlive their original purpose. It expresses itself in gross inefficiencies. It expresses itself in cobbled together legislative concoctions with lots of non-germane amendments and adaptations and carve-outs for special interests that are really problematic. And at its core, we want to argue, it expresses itself in ineffectiveness and inability of the government to actually solve problems. There's lots of ways to critique government and to critique the Constitution. We want to hone in specifically on the capacity of our government to solve problems. That's what motivates us. And we're going to try to offer both an explanation for where it comes from and what we might do about it. So, where does it come from? There's lots of boogeymen in contemporary American politics, and many of them are real. So there's a great deal of concern about the polarization of the two major parties, about money in politics, about the growth of lobbying, about a chattering class in a fragmented media market that's serving its own self-interested purposes, and all the hysteria that surrounds it. There's lots of things that people point to. And we're not going to offer a defense of any of that, right? This is not an argument that those things are actually quite good, no. But what we do want to say is that even if you did away with those features of contemporary American politics, our inability of the government to solve problems wouldn't be deeply corrected. The problems would persist. And the reason for that is that the ineffectiveness that we see all about us finds its origins most fundamentally in the very design of our political institutions. And that takes us back to the moment of origin with the Constitution. Now, I want to be clear about what kinds of problems, when we say problem solving, what kinds of problems do we have in mind? We have lots of problems in mind. Let me tick off a few. Climate change, tax reform, a bloated and expensive healthcare bureaucracy, massive escalating debt, a broken immigration system, huge inequalities that expresses itself in lots of different ways, entrenched poverty, and much, much more. What are these problems? They are problems that for people on the left and people on the right, they have different views about which one is more important, right? And they certainly have disagreements about what constitutes a solution. But we want to argue that this collection of problems, they're all, you'll notice, sort of national, if not global in nature. They belie easy answers. Solutions are going to require commitments over the long haul. There are no quick fixes to these things. And it's this class of problems, these types of things, which are complex and multidimensional, that our government has proven wholly incapable of offering solutions to. So why? Why? Well, we do point at the Constitution as the point of origin. And the argument is that it's in that point of origin that our political institutions were fashioned. And they were fashioned in a particular age for particular purposes. And that age and those purposes are very different from our own. And so it's this confluence of what happened at the point of origin and the massive changes that have occurred in the 225 years hence, which has led to a government that's out of sync with the challenges that we face in contemporary political life. That is most fundamentally the source of the problem that we're going to want to offer a corrective to. So what are we saying? What are we saying? At the moment of origin, right, when our government was fashioned, it was a tiny nation, an isolated nation, in which 95% of people were farmers. There were fewer than 4 million people, 700,000 of whom were slaves, less than 1 million of whom actually voted. They were concentrated in the Northeast and in the South. It was a radically different age in terms of size, in terms of power, in terms of sensibility, in terms of values than our contemporary age. And what we've seen since are massive, dramatic, awesome changes in what our country is, what it's become, and what challenges we face. The size of the country in population has increased by over 100-fold. The land mass that we now cover has increased massively. There's been huge structural changes to the economy, spurred on by an industrial revolution and subsequent massive technological changes. A couple of world wars dramatically altered the place of the United States in the world order. We see the emergence of the United States as a hegemonic power. The world in which we inhabit today, as we say in the book, is as different as a horse-drawn carriage and a Tesla. And the architecture of our government was forged in the era of the horse-drawn carriage, when the government wasn't expected to do much, when the government wasn't expected to solve very many problems. And the core purpose of government in that time was in no small part to guard against the tyranny of the majority. This was about putting in a set of protections to ensure that no single class would be in charge and could capture the government for their own private purposes. There's lots of checks. I mean, that's the defining feature of our government, right? A system of checks and balances. And the size of government was tiny. And the expectations for what that government would do were, it was about quelling domestic insurrections, but attending to a massive debt born of the Revolutionary War, and to attend to issues involving trade between the United States and other countries, and little more, sort of it, right? So while the left and the right have debates about what the proper boundaries are of government, what we ought to be doing, we've moved way past that, right? What we're talking about, what the boundaries of that debate are way past what the original conception of what the government ought to be doing. And that's, again, in no small part because our country has changed dramatically, and the kinds of challenges we face as a country have changed dramatically. They're much more dynamic, they're bigger, they require faster solutions. And what we have is a government for which ineffective responses to big, trenchant, difficult problems is not an unfortunate sort of mistake, but rather it's, again, baked into the very fabric of the institution. How so? Two things to note. The first one is separation of powers, right, first and foremost. Separation of powers, which is dividing government horizontally between a legislative and an executive and a judicial branch of government, that then within the legislative branches of government we have a bicameral system, right? And then we have a federal system that allots authority across a federal, state, and local system, and it makes it incredibly difficult to make meaningful coordinated change in order to solve problems. Lots of reasons for that, but if the only relevant criteria is, can we solve problems, separation of powers is a hindrance. The second piece, and the one that we want to really focus on, is that it's not just a separation of powers, but it's a separation of powers that puts Congress at the very center of government. It's a collective decision-making body that is the first branch of government. It isn't just recognized first in Article 1. It is seen as the locus of decision-making at the federal level. And so, all right, now we're going to start getting somewhere with this argument, which is it's not just that, right, the government that we have is out of sync with contemporary American challenges, which is true. It's that we have an architecture. We've got a collective decision-making body that's the first branch of government that does three things that we want to underscore that, again, aren't accidents. They are by design. The first is that if you want to think about legislators, generic legislators, don't think about people. Think about this, the office that we've created and the incentives that underscore the kinds of behaviors that anybody who's put into that office is likely to engage in. Right? We want to think about incentives here. We want to think about, and the perspective that they have that is born of those incentives. The first is that their sensibilities are going to be parochial in nature. Right? We elect legislators from districts and state, and it's by reference to the organized interests of those districts and state that legislatures will evaluate policy at every turn. Right? First point. They will channel parochialism. And they will channel parochialism, second point, with an eye towards the consequences of policy, not just for their district and state, but their consequences that are going to be borne out tomorrow when we elect policy today. They're especially sensitive to short-term considerations because they face elections, particularly in the House, every 2 years. And they are running scared. And they feel like they need to ensure that the electorate and the organized interests within it are their local interests are being tended to at every moment, right? Parochial, short-term, and then when you add those two pieces together and you think about the kinds of policy changes that are likely to emerge from policy, it's going to be policy changes wherein the disproportionate attention paid by each legislator is going to be to the pieces and not to the whole. They don't think about policy as a whole, what it means to make a coherent, systematic policy reform that's going to have integrity, but rather they're going to worry about, each legislator one at a time, about the piece that most directly affects their constituents today, and they're going to argue and fight on behalf of those interests and ensure that that piece, right, is attended to. That's legislator by legislator collectively. What is likely to emerge from that is what? Massive amalgamations of policy that lack internal coherence, that channel parochialism, and that are in the service of organized interests that express themselves today, right? That's what Congress, as a collective decision-making body, does well. Now, that's not to say that there aren't legislators who take it upon themselves, having attended to those particular imperatives, take it upon themselves to think bigger, right? For sure, we can name them. And they devote their careers to a policy domain that they care about. And of course, there are moments when Congress as a whole will shift its gaze from short-term parochial concerns to longer-term national ones, during times of emergency being a classic case, wherein things like after 9/11, there's a sense of, oh, we are all Americans, and we need to think about what's good for the country, and our shared identity as Americans is not just affirmed, but is channeled to a greater extent within Congress than it was before. But when emergencies lapse, the attention of legislators reliably shifts back to the local parochial interests of their constituents. And that's, again, not by mistake. Their basic orientation is to attend to the people who get them elected. And that leads to these pathologies which have to do with, again, channeling parochialism, an inability to attend to long-term challenges, and not to create policy that's going to affect meaningful policy change. An example. So we lament money in politics today and polarized party. Let's take an example when there was nowhere near the amount of money in politics, and when the parties were not nearly as polarized as they were, and go back to the Great Society and think about the Model Cities program that was advanced, which ostensibly was going to be a model of responsible policymaking. Who remembers the Model City? Do you know anything about Model Cities a bit? Okay, so Model Cities. This is a recognition by well-meaning first bureaucrats within the executive branch, and they put together a panel of experts who wanted to recognize that the challenges of poverty in urban settings around the country were multidimensional. We're not going to solve it just by fixing schools, or just by fixing housing, right? Or just by fixing the boundaries that are going to define where districts are. There's no single fix. It's multidimensional. It's the first recognition on the part of the members of this panel. And the second recognition is that we don't really know what the precise mix is. We know it's going to require a major infusion of money and attention and change, but we don't know exactly what the ingredients are that are going to actually turn around the pathologies of poverty in urban settings. And so the idea of a model cities program is that, well, let's use cities as laboratories to actually do this learning and see if we can't make a difference in a handful of cities to address these hard problems associated with poverty that have all these, right, many different dimensions to them, and then update our thinking and say, all right, we're going to do that in a serious way for 5, 10 years, and then we're going to say, what did we learn? And we're going to adjust. Like, there is a notion of responsible, hopeful policy making. This is handed over to Congress. What does Congress do? Well, what starts out as a handful of cities, right, that are going to get a bunch of money to try to solve these difficult problems, unravels. And it unravels because legislators one at a time say, yeah, that's great, you're going to do something for Detroit, but what about Austin? Okay? What about Austin? It's great you're going to do something now about Austin, but what about Colorado Springs? And each legislator one at a time has every incentive to step forward and argue on behalf of the cities and non-cities, the urban centers, to get a piece of the money associated with this Model Cities program, such that the program, when it actually gets rolled out, hands out a little bit of money to over 150 cities and townships around the country, and it has no effect whatsoever in either materially altering levels of poverty in urban centers or in providing a whole lot of learning for us about what we might actually do about the challenges associated with poverty. And that's not an exception, right? That's what Congress does and does well. Okay. So that's why we want to argue. It's built into the very design of Congress. Where are we going to find the leadership that we need to address these big, difficult, hard problems? We're going to direct our attention away from Congress and suggest it's with the president. Because on each of those scores, presidents are different. Whereas members of Congress are elected by districts and states, presidents uniquely represent the country as a whole, uniquely among our elected officials. Whereas legislators are thinking about 2 years out and whether or not they're going to get reelected. Presidents, to the extent you want to underscore a kind of core motivation, it would have to do with their legacy. They worry at every turn how they're going to be judged by subsequent historians and subsequent publics, where they're going to, what effect they're going to have on history, which casts their attention to the longer term. Not necessarily the long term, right, but the longer term. And again, because presidents sit alone atop their governing institution, because they care about legacy, because they represent the country as a whole, they think about the way in which policy fits together and coheres, which is why it's presidents regularly who are given reorganization authority within the executive branch, and why presidents create these things called czars, which are meant to correct for and allow for communication between disparate agencies within the executive branch. And why presidents, when they try to advance policy, are much more likely to pay attention to underlying systemic concerns. Now, big disagreements about what optimal policy looks like, what systemic reform actually ought to look like. I don't want to brush those under the rug, right? That on the right and on the left, Democrats and Republicans disagree vehemently about what the boundaries of government ought to be, what the purposes of government are, what optimal policy solutions look like. But where we want to step in is to say, well, those are in no small part what elections are about. Once we elect somebody, we put them, not somebody, but a whole group of people, we put them into positions of authority. And how might we allow for meaningful, effective change? What we ought to be doing is recognizing the unique voices and perspectives that all presidents have in fashioning solutions to these big, hard problems. And so the book is filled with lots of examples of presidents across policy domains and ideological orientations consistently trying to advance long-term national systemic policy reform. And we put forward a very specific institutional reform. And let me sketch out what that is, offer a couple of caveats, and then we can open this up. So the specific institutional reform is about universal, permanent, fast-track authority. What's fast-track authority? Fast-track authority is authority that's given to the president by Congress. It's been given it since the early 1970s on an on-and-off basis. Obama was just given it back, in which the president and his advisors go out, negotiate trade agreements, then they come back before Congress, they put a proposal before Congress. Congress then has to vote on that proposal on an up or down basis within a fixed period of time. The effect, what we've learned from this move, is that it's led to the liberalization of trade and the expansion of globalization and the engagement of the United States with lots of other countries, which is a quintessential national issue where national considerations are in no small part at odds with some local constituents. But what you have are presidents from both the left and the right consistently, because of where they sit in our politics, recognizing that, look, my goal is to do what's good for the country, and economists overwhelmingly, nearly uniformly recognize that free trade during the last 40 years, this is contested now, but during the last 40 years, has been good for the country, and presidents in no small part have been advancing that, right? Okay, so this is then about expanding the president's proposal-making powers. That's what the proposal that I'm putting before you. It's not about a generically more powerful president. There are other ways in which you could augment executive authority by expanding their unilateral powers or by giving them a line item veto or any number of things. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is allowing the president to be the agenda setter, to be among the agenda setters, to be a privileged agenda setter, to be fair. Because it requires then Congress to subsequently act. If they don't act, if they don't vote, the bill that's proposed will automatically become law. But Congress is perfectly free to vote down anything the president puts forward. If a majority in either chamber votes against the president, the bill dies. Congress is free to carry on its way and to continue to propose and consider legislative initiatives on its own. Right now, we live in a world in which the only proposal maker when it comes to lawmaking is to be found within Congress. And again, Congress channels short-term parochial concerns. So the argument in the book is to say among the agenda setters ought to be the president. The president doesn't have this authority. It's been good for the country as a whole that he's been given it when it comes to trade policy. It's been good. He's been given a much weaker version of this, but it has been good in rationalizing the appropriations process, which the president has had proposal-making power since 1921. It's nowhere near as robust, the kind of proposal-making power that we're talking about here. But it's in the service, in the main, of augmenting executive proposal-making power so as to advance effective government. And that requires us to think beyond and to think critically about the institutions that we've inherited from that point of origin, which was a distant age that looked very different from our own, where the values and objectives of government were radically different from what they are today. So let me stop there, and we can kind of poke and prod and see what we can do with this.
Very good, thank you. Well, why don't we have a seat, and we'll talk over just a couple of issues, have you unpack this a little bit further before we take questions from the audience. It's a fascinating thesis, no doubt provocative, if not controversial. Just a kind of the first question that comes to mind that I think would be good for you to hear you talk a little bit more about is just this basic issue of what the separation of powers was originally for, and whether or not it still has relevance today. Because a very common objection to your thesis right off the bat would be to say gridlock's actually part of the game.
Yes.
Right. And so under your proposal, that this is one way to kind of get beyond the gridlock that people talk about. But I think a basic question that people would have is who decides what's a national issue in this case? I mean, obviously the president gets to do that, but I think probably the concern that some people would have would be that you'd have a president sort of forcing his or her will.
Yes.
And declaring things that are national issues, which should rightly be left to the states.
Yes. Yes. So you touched on a lot of important issues. Separation of powers makes it difficult to get stuff done. And so in any introduction to American politics course, we point out the fact that gridlock is not a mistake, an unintended byproduct of the design of our political institutions, but was in some ways the point, right? For sure. Now and there were reasons for that, right? Again, there were deep concerns. We continue to have deep concerns about the concentration of authority in any individual. And we worry about the tyranny of the majorities today as we did at the point of origin. It is, and I think it is objectively an impediment to getting stuff done. Now, our suggestion is not, though, to do away with separation of powers. Separation of powers in our proposal are alive and well. Congress is free to vote down. The courts can still step in and rule things as being unconstitutional. There are the tensions between the federal and state governments and the arguments that occur over what the purposes of government ought to be and who ought to be engaged in particular policy domains will persist. The suggestion here is that, look, the only proposal maker in town need to be legislators. And so we ought to allow for presidents to come forward precisely because presidents have a unique perspective, and a unique perspective that's in the service of effective government when it comes to, again, the kinds of big problems having to do with immigration, tax reform, climate change, these complex, multidimensional, long-term problems. If you're looking for leadership on these kinds of things, the president's the only game in town. You aren't going to rationalize the tax code by leaving it up to members of Congress. You won't do so. And if you're interested in rationalizing the tax code, you've got to look to executive leadership. The problem now is that the presidents regularly can't get a vote, right? They can't get a vote on the proposals that they put forward. Now, this is not to say that if you give the president this proposal-making power, one, all parochial concerns will disappear, right? Two, that suddenly the floodgates of legislation are going to open up and we're going to be awash in new federal government. I don't think either of those things are true. But I think what we will see is in our public debate a greater attention paid to the longer term and national concerns. We will see members of Congress having to vote on policy that they might not like to vote right now for partisan reasons. It may be difficult for them to, right? They're being protected against it. And that there will be some policies where we actually will see change, where the majorities are in place to get behind comprehensive change, but you can't get a vote currently. The president can't get a vote in one chamber or the other, which is a big impediment to actually affecting change.
Right, and isn't the part of the advantage to the deliberative process that Congress goes through when it's considering issues, basically the culling of lots of pieces of information
Yes.
from across the country, from various constituencies, local and interest group based. What about the role of the executive here? I mean, part of the congressional process of hearing from constituents and holding hearings and all of that is to try to make well-informed decisions about the issue of the day. wouldn't this just require the executive to grow even more massive to be able to conduct as much information getting as possible as it can? I mean, how is an executive going to get the information necessary to actually put forward a proposal that's legitimate?
Well, presidents have this massive bureaucracy, right, that's within their branch of government where they can call all kinds of information and expertise in the service of a policy reform. Again, this is not to argue that all the policy reforms are going to be the right reforms, that they're going to get it right at every turn. I am less hopeful about the status of deliberation within Congress, right? The idea that there are rich, meaningful conversations, responsible conversations currently within Congress about the kinds of issues I've raised, I don't see it. What we do here, though, is, I think, the channeling of local concerns reliably within Congress, and there's a place for that. Like, that's important. We should have a branch of government that's going to represent local concerns and short-term concerns. If the only game in town is big national long-term objectives, and we're going to put our, that leads to the federal government putting its foot on the neck of certain subpopulations today, that's problematic. That's deeply problematic, which is why we're not saying what we ought to do is refashion Congress to look more like the president. Right? There ought to be a contestation across these branches of government. But again, the only proposal maker, right, we shouldn't have a world in which we currently have it, where the only proposal maker when it comes to lawmaking is within Congress. This is about the president being able to come forward and say, nope, we're going to think on this along this issue, along national lines, and members of Congress can push, prod, and rebuke what the president does. So does it lead inexorably to an aggrandizement of executive authority? It leads to a more privileged space that the president plays in the debates that we have about these hard issues, for sure. And we want to argue that's to the good, but not to the exclusion of continued debate within Congress, and an articulation of local short-term concerns that Congress is really quite good at channeling.
And you've written a whole book about the presidential use of executive orders in terms of getting things done. Would this proposal, how would this proposal change the behavior of the executive right now? Because that one pops up in the news a lot. People hear this one, that Republicans criticize President Obama for his use of executive orders. Then Obama's supporters point out that George W. Bush did the same.
Exactly.
And it's a pattern of executive power that you know very well. How would this proposal affect that, if at all?
Well, I think it would. So presidents exercise these unilateral powers, which they've made up on their own, for the most part, right? There's a thing which we're now going to call an executive order, and I shall use it to promulgate policy change, right? And that eventually becomes rationalized and recognized by the adjoining branches of government. But there's a lot of innovation, to put it nicely, within the executive branch that's trying to affect policy change. Why is that? I mean, the core reason why that is because when Congress is gridlocked, right, in those moments where Congress is incapable of affecting policy change, where the president can't get a hearing and advance policy legislatively, presidents have powerful incentives because of where they sit, for many of the reasons we talk about in the book, to then say, all right, I'm not just going to sit here, right, in the face of big problems. I'm actually going to try to do something about it. And so we regularly see presidents going forward with their proposed reform, getting rebuked by Congress, not because it was voted on or considered on the president's term, but because he either can't get a vote or because it is taken apart piece by piece, and this sort of grotesque, incoherent conglomeration of local policy concoctions are pressed together, and we call that a law. That presidents then say, look, I got to get something done. I actually want to go do something. And so they look for other ways of doing so. If the president was, if Obama could have gotten a vote on immigration reform, we can have a debate about whether or not it would have passed. Chances are it would pass. We don't then see the subsequent activity that people on the right point at as being a gross abuse of executive authority when it comes to the unilaterally advanced changes on immigration policy. Just as if Bush, in his second term, could have gotten a vote on Social Security reform, thinking about long-term fiscal well-being of that, or on immigration reform as well, that some of the subsequent activity that we observe that the left decries as being a gross abuse of the Constitution, right? would have attenuated. I think this puts the president where he ought to be and leads to less of this sort of unilateral activity.
It's really interesting. Now, ideological polarization is often blamed for the gridlock in Washington, and you're not necessarily disagreeing with that, but you're pointing out that there's a structural problem beneath that, which it gets intertwined, I guess, with ideological polarization. Is it your view that this change, because it would require people to vote up or down, would actually maybe reduce ideological polarization in politics? Because people would essentially not just be obstructionists, but because they'd have to work constructively with the executive, or do you think this doesn't affect that?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think the polarization that we observe is in no small part a function of the elections, right, that are occurring around the country and the people we're putting into office. And we're not talking about electoral reform, but we are talking about the president forcing votes that legislators would just as soon not have to make. And in no small part, they would not, sometimes they would not like, they would prefer not to make them because it makes their efforts at getting reelected difficult. It compromises them. And so we were talking yesterday about majority leaders as being possible alternatives. Rather than giving enhanced, agenda-setting powers to the president, why not look to majority leaders as the source of national long-term perspectives? But majority leaders, they too are elected from districts and states, and their primary concern is about advancing the interests of parties. And this disrupts that. And if part of the polarization that we observe are parties that are walking in lockstep with one another, right? And you've got this machinery in place within the legislative branch, which is allowing them to do so, this certainly disrupts that. And would that then lead to less polarization? I don't know. But I think it may well have spillover effects in terms of the ability of incumbents to stay elected because they're going to have to cast some uncomfortable votes.
Let me get the audience engaged here and see what kind of questions we have. I'll go ahead and shuttle the microphone around. Just put your hand up where I can see it. Thanks.
When you say you want him or her to put forward a proposal, is it a bill that's already written for an up and down vote? Because I can see two things. He makes a broad proposal, Congress poisons it. Does it go back to him so he can veto it? Or
It's without amendment. It's an up or down vote.
okay,
So it's without amendment, but it's got to be a complete bill, precisely because it's going to be up or down. In the same way that presidents with fast-track authority, right, come forward and say, here are the terms of the trade deal that we've worked out. There might be this piece. You would love to keep everything about that trade deal, right, in place, except carve out an exception for your local industry, right? That's what you would like, but so would you, and so would you, and so would you. And so legislators, recognizing this basic problem, have tied their hands and conferred this authority of the president in order to avoid the trade deals from unraveling for precisely this reason. This would simply apply in other policy domains as well. That's not to say, though, that local concerns would be altogether ignored. First, because again, Congress can reject the president, right? First. And second, if then I'm going to get the majorities that I need as president, I'm going to recognize your key vote, right? I need your support, and I'm going to have to put some sugar in for you, right? So this isn't going to do away with all earmarks and special favors and loopholes but it provides something of a check on them. It limits them. It reduces them. Yeah.
Other questions?
So to continue to just clarify, because I didn't have time to read the review or the book at this point, all you're proposing is that a fully drafted piece of legislation be put forth by the president and then voted on by both houses of the Congress.
On an up or down basis.
And so a straight majority, it's going to require a straight majority by both houses to pass.
Correct. And there's one additional piece, which is, and they have to vote on it on a certain period of time. And we could have a debate about how long is enough time. It needs to be 3 months, 3 weeks, right? 6 months. And we're silent about that. But they don't get to just see the bill and carry on their merry way. They have to cast votes on it.
So does your book go into the line of thought that would put forth that even in the case of highly polarized or biased president, which I think we have today, that because of the approvals that he's having to seek of both houses of Congress, that he would by definition have to consider almost a compromise structure to a bill in order for it to have any potential
of actually getting passed. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. But what he can't get now is an actual vote on his terms. This is an enhancement of executive authority, right? For sure. But it's saying there's all sorts of concessions that the president has to make now. There's a type of concession, though, that the president's having to make, which is to fully indulge the parochial short-term sensibilities of legislators, which again will be curtailed if the president can say, "No, you got to vote on this, up or down." Right? That's it, and then they're free to vote it down. So this isn't generically more powerful, getting exactly what he wants.
At the outset, you gave a pretty good litany of commonly held objections and grievances and complaints, et cetera, et cetera. But I would describe everything you said as, academic, which is appropriate since you're an academician. But the reason I pipe up is that I worked in Washington for 33 years. I've seen this movie from every seat in the theater.
Mm-hmm.
I was legislative counsel in the Senate. I was in the Reagan White House. I was in the bureaucracy as Deputy Secretary of Commerce. I was in private law practice and dealt with this all day long, every day, regulatorily, legislatively, et cetera. I guess one misunderstanding that virtually everybody has is how thorough a piece of legislation is. It is nothing more than a skeleton, no matter how voluminous that legislation might be. The devil is what is not in it. All of the interstices, all the organs, everything underneath the skin that fills it, the body, that is the domain of the executive branch. That's the fourth branch of government. What you've described basically is in my opinion, is to champion the last 6 years. You have a wantonly powerful executive. If anything, I would argue that it's the legislative branch that needs to be strengthened. The default and irresponsible default, in my opinion, that was exhibited by Harry Reid when he was the Democratic leader in the Senate was to dodge votes constantly. The federal overreach, of which the Republican Party largely screams bloody murder about today, gave rise to the Tea Party in 2010. The pushback for everything you're saying would be simply overwhelming. It needs to be more democratization, not more concentration. I wonder also whether you, in your devil's advocacy, when you were before your book was published, whether you went through the Federalist Papers and knocked down all those straw men, because what you're proposing is basically an altogether new Continental Congress. And I grant you that there are plenty of problems with the current apparatus, but I just think that everything you've described is a fairy tale. It's academic. It will never happen because you're reducing the democratization of the country.
Okay, there are like 17 dimensions to your objection.
That's exactly right.
And so the lack of democratization, there's nothing about changes in electoral reform that we're talking about. We're talking about free, open elections for the various branches of government. The powers given to the various branches of government has continuously adapted and changed over the last 125 years in particular. And this is not about giving wanton exclusive power to the president to the exclusion of Congress. This is about sharing proposal-making power, which right now Congress exclusively has, that then is going to be subject to a vote by legislators who are free to vote against it. So the idea that this leads to a deep perversion of democratic processes, I simply don't see. That we will elect people as a country, sometimes who certain folks will like and sometimes you won't like, but we live with those elections, and the question is, are we going to elect people into institutions that can actually solve problems? Right now, we don't live in that world. And the argument that we're making is not in the service of Obama's agenda or Bush's agenda, or whoever the next president's going to be, but in the service of recognizing the unique voice that presidents have in paying attention to national considerations and long-term considerations that are not a part of our politics and that are not a part of legislative deliberation to the extent that they ought to be. These things are hard, these are hard problems, right? This is not about my guy has the solution. I want to augment his, someday her authority so that I can get what I want to the exclusion of others. These are hard problems. We need to debate them. We are not debating them right now in a serious way. And there's nothing that keeps somebody on the right from assuming office. Take Reagan's tax reform, right? The 86 tax bill. What does he do? This is Reagan stepping in saying, this tax code that we have is obscene, right? The number of carve-outs and exceptions that are put into place. And he rationalizes it, reduces the number of both the size of the tax code and the number of rackets, thank you. And which is about effective government, which is about rationalizing a process, right? What does Congress do in the following years? They undo all of that handiwork, right? And they build it right back up. They do what Congress does best, which is to then carve out exceptions and special rules and loopholes and the like, which is not in the service of effective government. And so this is not clearly on the side of the right or the left, big government, small government. It's not. It's about trying to think about how we can offer a voice to long-term national concerns, which we have experience doing. That is fast-track authority, which we've done in trade. And I would argue it has been good for the country that the president's been given fast-track authority over the last 40 years.
I agree with that.
So, what we're talking about is generalizing it.
Absolutely right.
Right. So,
but I just don't see how in the world are you going to have an elected representative who walks into it knowing that he's going to be in a straitjacket with just responding to a central executive proposing legislation. I mean, basically what you have right now is a hyper executive who sees a vacuum and fills it by means of executive orders, federal overreach, a supine Congress in many respects, Republican majority in both houses, who simply will not step up and challenge in a meaningful way, other than lip service, to an abusive departure from the contours of the second article of the Constitution. I just think that everything that you're saying is sort of make-believe, and it will, there's no way that any of this will ever come to fruition. In this country, as long as there is a Constitution.
So this is where we go. This is where we go back to the original point, which is we ought to be thinking critically about that Constitution. We should be. We needn't be. No, we're talking about a constitutional amendment, and we've had a number of them. We're talking about another constitutional amendment, and that the idea that we're going to right this ship by reaching back and thinking about, well, what would Madison do if he sat where we sat, is not a helpful exercise. We're trying to recover the values in that moment of origin, as if that is going to provide a guidance on how we meet the profound challenges that we face as a country. It won't. It won't. Again, goes back to, in that moment of origin, a radically different country with radically different values. And that's not to disparage what they did, but what they did was a beginning, and that we would do well to continue to think what challenges we face on our terms and what kinds of institutions that we need in order to meet those challenges. And we certainly will have live debates about the size of the federal government versus local government, what good policy looks like. Absolutely. But we ought to have, as part of those debates, somebody, not dominating it, but as part of it, somebody who can articulate national concerns. I don't think this is fairy tale at all. I think we have, the last 100 years, lots of examples of Congress delegating authority during periods of divided government to the president, recognizing their own institutional inefficiencies. You observe this with a Republican Congress giving Clinton the line item veto. We're not going to argue on behalf of the line item veto, but this was a case where Congress recognizes they've got a problem with spending and earmarks, and they say the only way we're going to get a check on our own proclivities is by delegating authority to the executive branch. The Supreme Court steps in and overturns that and undermines that. So look, if you're given even odds on a bet of a constitutional amendment going through, you should always vote against, for sure. But we have a lot of experience with institutional reform of the type that we're describing that often occurs during times when we've got divided party control and there's widespread disaffection, I think, in the American public that's with what's going on in Congress. Congressional approval ratings are in the toilet. And a part of those concerns, again, is the inability of the government to solve problems. We may disagree about what those problems are or what ought to be done about it. That's the stuff of elections. And those debates will persist when a president comes forward and says, I want to do something about policy X. They will persist. We're not talking about curtailing those things, but we are talking about giving a forum in which presidents can articulate, as presidents, not as liberals or Republicans or Democrats, or as presidents, can articulate a set of perspectives and prerogatives that are in the service of effective government. And so, and I think that that's something, my hope is, that Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives can get behind. However big that government is, we all ought to be in favor of effective government that actually does something in the service of solving problems, not just passing big laws and spending a ton of money, but actually solving problems. And that's not what we have now, and we don't have it by constitutional design. So I'm all for thinking critically about the institutions that we've inherited from 225 years ago and how we might sharpen them. And it might make me academic and removed and not knowing facts on the ground, but it's in the service, I think, of fundamental real change. Because when we wave our hands about the problems of polarized parties and we could just do away with the money, and if we could just pass this latest policy solution, then our lives will be made better, I want to say no. That there's something deeper and more insidious that we've inherited from a long time ago that we need to do something about. And so that may make us politically irrelevant today. I think it's the right argument to be having and fight to put forward.
Okay, another question? Okay, we'll go here and then here.
Hi, thank you. I know we talked a little bit yesterday, and I'd like to go back to this idea that information and deliberation in Congress plays a role in creating not only good law, but also durable law. And we talked a little bit about some of my research, but I wanted to go into a couple of the more interesting findings that have nothing really to do with whether or not divided governments or unified governments are passing legislation, but things that are going on within the legislature that are promoting deliberation. So things like passing legislation through multiple committees, having them considered under open rules without post-committee adjustments. All of these kind of finite procedures end up increasing the durability of legislation, but they're also at the same time, they're increasing the number of voices and perspectives, right, that play a role in crafting the law. And they might be parochial interests, or we might also consider that they're longer term than that. I mean, the Senate was designed as an institution that had longer term considerations than the House. And so there's, I think, a role for Congress actually being the deliberative body that is going to produce enduring solutions that are actually fixing problems on the ground. So I want you to respond to that. And then I have a second question. I know you know Sean Theriault. He's recently started some work on problem solvers in Congress. And particularly, he's looking at individuals in the Senate who are inserting non-germane amendments in order to force unpalatable votes on members of the majority. So you saw this with like the Viagra Amendment and the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. What would be a disincentive to presidents to use their up and down, right, vote authority on whatever particular policy they put before Congress? What would be the incentive for them not to use it as a symbolic gesture to force an unpalatable vote on an issue instead of long-term considerations, right? It could be used politically. So those are my kind of two questions.
They're great. And here too, I heard actually more than two. There are a number of dimensions to this. I want to underscore again, this is not about shutting down deliberations. It's altering the terms under which that deliberations occur, for sure. And it's providing an alternative to the production of legislation to what we currently have, where the only proposal maker is a proposal maker within Congress. Right? And it's saying, no, you have to deal with the president on the president's term. You can deliberate all you'd like. Now, if the president's going to get this thing through, right? The president's going to get this thing through, the president's going to have to anticipate the kind of reaction that she is likely to get. And so it isn't just the deliberation that we observe. We're going to see a lot of anticipatory action going on the president's part, which is going to figure into the kinds of proposals that he actually makes. Again, I go back to this point that I'm less impressed by the status of deliberation within Congress when it comes to the kinds of problems I've underscored, which are big, national, global in nature, really complex. I don't see deep, meaningful, serious engagement. And the finding that says that when you get more bills going through more committees, having heard more voices leads to policy that lasts longer, is apart from something that says that the policies actually solve problems. We don't know that. And if what you think is part of the problem is that we have policies that are enacted that outlive their original rationale, you might say, no, they're passing bills that then you can't subsequently undo and that we continue to live with. And programs that we're continuing to pay for that were supposed to solve a problem that we've solved decades ago, and yet here we continue to live with them. So that's not to say that that is true, right? But rather that we don't know, right? We don't know what the translation is from legislative durability to ability to solve problems. Those are two separate things, and there's a lot to be said for a nimble government that's going to update and learn and revisit and alter. So we're not trying to shut down debate. We recognize these are hard problems. But when the agenda setter, the person in the driver's seat, the institution in the driver's seat, when it comes to lawmaking, is an institution that is as parochial as Congress is and pays attention to the short term as Congress does by institutional design, that keeps us from talking seriously and I think responsibly about the kinds of problems that we actually face. So it is, I mean, we both care about the deliberation. I don't think this shuts down deliberation. I think there's something to be said for it actually enhancing and enriching the deliberation that we have. So that it doesn't, a conversation about comprehensive tax reform doesn't devolve into each individual legislator's exceptions that they need for their industry. But to then say, no, we need to think about this as a coherent whole. And the only game in town to do that is the president. Now, he doesn't do it perfectly. And sometimes he's going to advance policies that are misguided and wrong, for sure. We need checks, for sure. But we ought to enhance that voice in the deliberation, so to structure the deliberation that follows.
Yeah, thank you for your thought-provoking presentation. You've called for a greater congressional grant of or delegation of authority to the president. And there's another delegation they used to do. They used to delegate to the president executive reorganization authority from the 20s through the 80s. It's lapsed since about 84. It allowed the president to kind of consolidate and streamline the bureaucracy, maybe make things a bit simpler and more rational. So in line with your call for permanent standing fast-track authority, what do you think of the idea of a permanent standing reorganization authority? You think that would be compatible, kind of a similar idea in line with what you're proposing?
So this is a great example. So why were they given this authority, right, initially? And why, while they no longer have formal reauthorization authority, right, because that was struck down by the courts, they nonetheless continue to engage in this project of trying to rationalize the bureaucracy. Again, presidents on both the left and the right, that's their project. Right? They inherit this mess of a bureaucracy that then they try to make sense of. So why is that? And again, this goes to this basic point, which is that presidents are champions of effective government. Right? They are. They're not. They think about the whole in ways that individual legislators do not. The fact that the bureaucracy is such a mess is in no small part a function of Congress, right? Creating agencies and duplicating agencies and right, putting their imprint again and again where they channel these parochial short-term considerations, and that presidents act as a counterforce against that. Sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes they're misguided. Sometimes it's in the service of policies that we don't like, for sure. but that certainly is consistent with the kind of perspective that presidents have. And that's why, that's why I see czars, which again is a similar manifestation of presidents trying to solve the same problem, which is I've got 17 different agencies, right, in some policy domain, and I don't know who to believe, and I've got a problem that I'm trying to solve, so I'm going to put somebody in charge as a way to try to get control of this beast. That's the kind of thing that presidents do, which is why when we say that they're champions of effective government, right, that it carries over not just to the promulgation of policy, but also to the design of institutions.
Well, with that, I will have to draw our Q&A time to a close. Thank you for the book, for the debate that it's starting. Good luck with it.
Thanks.
Read the Wall Street Journal review today. And please join me in thanking Dr. Will Howell for coming today.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it. That was fun.